Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Where did Trump come from, and where is Trumpism going without the former president at the helm, or has he left the helm? This opens up larger questions about the Republican Party as a whole and what it means for one of the country's two major parties, seemingly having coupled themselves with Trump during his presidency and leading up to his presidency. In his post-presidency, what's the path forward? And with the Senate recently having acquitted Trump for the second time, what does this tell us about where they're headed? But a conversation on the political futures of the American people would not be complete without
True Chat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
No matter how you look at this, and it's the same with most topics, there is a historical path that we have taken as a nation that led to the election of Trump and the Trump movement. And the word of the day is follower, Follower. In Webster's, a follower, the first definition, a person or thing that follows, specifically A, a person who follows another's beliefs or teachings, a disciple, or B, a servant or attendant. And since it used the word follow to define follower, to be exact, the word follow means to come or to go after. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Why did people decide to follow Donald Trump and vote for him and his ideas? And then for the most part, even though all the things that have taken place, many of those people still consider themselves followers of Donald Trump and his type of republicanism.
Why are you following them? Is it because you had beliefs that they were able to identify with, or did they provide beliefs that then you identified with? And I guess the point that I'm trying to make there is which did it start with, right? And I think the article, Lance, that we're referencing, which of course can be found at thestateofus.org, and it's linked, it's a Wall Street Journal article, points out that at the outset of the 2016 presidential campaign, Chris Christie, the then governor of New Jersey, sensed a yearning within a changed Republican Party for a populist voice. A political figure who knew how to speak bluntly to the ranks of working class voters in the GOP. So that's who Trump set out to be, a no-nonsense everyman from outside Washington who talked about the economic travails of a prototypical 45-year-old construction worker, the need to use government aggressively to end the opioid crisis in America, the virtues of law and order, and the need to, quote, stop the Washington bull, end quote. And it's easy, Lance, right? Because we generally as people have a tendency, and this is not just Republicans, we like to find things to blame. And blaming Washington for our struggles is easy, and sometimes it's very justified. So he saw this opportunity and seized upon it. The question is, was there more behind it than just that?
The historical reference here is, you hear the phrase, could have been in the word of the day, populist or populism. And Trump seized on that, but the article points out that you can go back to the 1980s, actually the 1990s, the start of this populist movement within the Republican Party with Pat Buchanan, and then followed up with H. Ross Perot. So for some of you older listeners like me, you remember those gentlemen. And that's when this populist movement started within the Republican Party. And Trump just seized on it, and he was one of three, as the article points out, not only Chris Christie, but former politician from Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, also went that route, as well as former governor of Ohio, John Kasich. So there was a real movement within the Republican Party in 2014, 2015, 2016 to grasp onto this populist movement that they felt was going on, that the Republican Party had changed, that it wasn't white college educated voters anymore, that many of tried and true Democrats had gotten lost in the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party that was, talking about abortion and gun control and same-sex marriage, and they were floundering politically, and they latched on to the Republicans. And so these folks saw that and said, we need a populist movement to speak to these people. And the difference with Trump, as it's pointed out in the article, is he did it with negativity. Instead of saying, these are all the good things we're going to get done, these are all the horrible reasons why these things are happening to you. And that's a big difference. He was big on blaming everybody, but not really big on talking about what to do to fix it. Even if he did some good things for the country, you didn't feel a part of it because he didn't make you feel a part of it, because he was standing up there saying, I did this, I did this, I did this. And it's like, oh, I played no role in it.
I think the thing that comes to mind as you're talking about that too is the understanding, right, of what you're talking about is not necessarily Republican, so to speak, right? I mean, yeah, some of the themes are, right? Some of the answers, solutions, what have you, maybe some of those things are. But really what he's seizing on is a sense of fear, I think, right? Or what he had seized on was a sense of fear amongst many. And again, we could discuss whether or not the fear is justified. I think some of the fears are justified, right? That, for example, middle America is being left behind. And that's across, I think, the political spectrum. That's not just, for example, if we turn to a lot of young people, right, who are headed into college, and you look at, they are generally optimistic about their future, but they're not generally optimistic about their generation's future and their ability to overcome the adversities of the country. And that's, again, that's amongst a group that is interested, heavily was interested in supporting Bernie Sanders. So the point there is that I think a lot of these feelings and sentiments exist, but what you're seeing is a lot of different ways that sort of more populist candidates are looking to seize on those. And to your point, Lance, when it becomes you're the one that brought the success and you're the one that got it done, then people also come to rely on you being the answer, not necessarily what you're speaking about, right? And then you can set aside all of the policy and all of the talk about, is this a good idea? Because at the end of the day, it's not about whether the thing is a good idea. It's about this person is the right idea. And to your point, historically, that's part of how populist figures work. It's not just a, far-right conservative thing in the United States of America that's never happened before. It happens frequently with populist candidates because, again, it's about the candidate almost more than it becomes maybe about their ideology, at least in this case.
Well, and we saw it way back at the turn of the century when you had William Jennings Bryan, and the whole idea at that point in time, the country was moving from agricultural, from a rural area to urban. And what do we have again? You just mentioned it, that rural America feels lost. They feel like they're not being brought along with all these changes. And they're not, because the world's changing. Just like, 120 years ago, everybody was leaving farming and moving to the cities to work in the factories. Well, now the factories are changing and technology is taking over and robots and drones are doing the job, and there aren't the need for the humans to do that work. Now there are a need for humans to know how to fix the drones and how to program the computers and the robots to do the work, but it's changing. And so the fears are real. They are being left behind. Those types of workers are not as necessary in the workforce. And it's like, we want somebody to stand up for us. And that's when populism takes hold. And in this case, that's, I think, what happened. And you also have, you said it's not the true conservative Republican. No, it wasn't free trade. It was nationalism. It was everything you look at a populist movement. And it is those people that are disenfranchised or feel disenfranchised who grab onto that, because the person is promising to go back to what it was, right? Make America great again. I mean, listen to the phraseology there. We're going to go back. Well, history tells us you can never go back, right? You can take a step backwards, but you're not going to get rid of computers. You're not going to get rid of robots. though they're going to continue.
Well, and that's part of the article points this out, and I think it's a good point. We saw the culmination of what can happen, right, as a result of populism. And this is, you and I distinguished this when we talked, shortly after the insurrection at the Capitol took place. The reality is something like that is possible in part because when you latch on, and this is what I said before that I think it goes back to, right? When you latch on to a specific person being the answer, I think for so many it became, and we saw lots of surveys that indicated this, right? It was Trump, then the Republican Party, and not the reverse. And for so long, I think for both parties, it was the party and then the candidate, right? I'm going to vote because of the party and what the party stands for and what the party believes in. And it became, they didn't really care what the Republican Party was about, right? As long as the party was about Trump. And when it becomes about a person, then if that person is going to be taken away, right? If they're going to be removed from their position to help you, now what? Because everything rests on them. So what happens to the Republican Party? Or is it just going to stay the party of Trump because they can't figure out a path forward? And that's the interesting question that's been posed as a result of the Senate trial and Trump's subsequent acquittal. What will become of the Republican Party? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
In short, the problem has been the inability, or perhaps failure, of the GOP to separate Trumpism from Trump. In the view of John Kasich, a former governor of Ohio, who also ran in 2016, the party chose in Trump negative populism, which sought scapegoats and defined itself by what it was against, rather than positive populism defined by what it was for. End quote. And that is from the Wall Street Journal and part of what Lance was referencing in our first segment. I think that's a really interesting, distinct point, right, Lance? There's the people that believe in Trumpism, the policy, and you and I have tried, and this is part of why I think we don't see as much of it in the news media, is this is a difficult distinction for people to think about. The people that supported Trump because of some of the things he got done that they cared about, and the people that supported Trump because it was Trump, right? And I think the difference is the people that supported Trump because it's Trump, those are the ones that were probably more likely to go after the Capitol, right? The ones that we care about the ideology here, we care about the policies that are being put in place, maybe not so likely, right? Because those are also the same people that would openly tell you, I don't like the way he behaves. I don't like some of the things he says, but he's getting the policy done that I want done. And that's will the GOP be able to separate Trumpism from Trump?
The point is, it takes both of those groups to be the majority, right? Because, the election was close, even the popular vote, but it took both of those groups to make it close and to put Trump in office in the first place. So I don't know how you wed those two groups. How do you have the group who wants the policies with the group that wants Donald Trump? That's the sticky point. And we're seeing it right now. There is, now that the trial is over, that we see former President Trump and Mitch McConnell going after one another because both want control, because both are after the same thing. And that is power. And I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. We could talk about it, but that, Mitch McConnell's entire political life has been about getting control and then keeping control. And Donald Trump, I think, enjoyed the power that he had as president of the United States. And so we're going to see these two men battle back and forth, as you said, for the control of the Republican Party. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. I think we're going to see, my prediction is we'll see the Republican Party split, because as you pointed out, just using what you said, there's two different groups. There are the people who followed Trump, And then there are the more, not the populist, but the more conservative Republicans who wanted conservative Supreme Court justices, who wanted tougher trade sanctions with China, who wanted some of those things that Trump did. Now, I personally don't necessarily agree with all of those. Some of them worked better than others. I'm not necessarily in favor of those, but that's what they wanted, and Trump provided those. Then you have the group that I really like it when Trump gets up there and just badmouths people and tells them off, because that's what I wish I could do to my boss. And so you're going to have to keep both of those people happy. And I'm not sure you can do that. I think the line you have to walk is so fine. I see this at some point blowing up in the Republican Party's face, which would be interesting, because then I think we'll get a third party, and then the Democrats would stay in control for another 4 years, and the 2024 election would then be about who finishes second, much like we had back in 1856 when we had the Democrats in charge and the Free Soil Party and the Republicans and the Know Nothings, and everybody ran for president, and the Republicans finished second. And so then they became the challenging party, which then in the following election, which would be 2028, and that time it was 1860, the Republican Party elected a divided nation, Abraham Lincoln, as the president. So there's the historical reference as to what could happen. Very quickly, I just want to speak to, I was reading something. I actually had a listener send me something that was I verified, and that is that for millennials right now, they are the first generation since 1940, coming out of the Great Depression, going into World War II, who is not expected to out-earn their parents.
Yep.
Fascinating. When you talk about being left behind, every generation since, the greatest generation ever, the ones who lived through the Depression and fought in World War II and, defended democracy and made the United States the world power that it claims to be today. That hasn't always been, for 200 years, we haven't been the world power. We emerged as the world power after World War II. That young people that you talked about are the first generation that are expected not to out-earn their parents since that point in time.
Well, it gives some credence to the notion that it's not just whining, right? I mean, but here's, like so many things, right? You can whine and still be right. So, and notice that I said it's not just whining.
Well, and what political party is going to catch on to that, right? I mean, if this is a truism, as you said, if it is whining, but it's still true, what political party or what group, or do we have another populist movement? What person catches on to that idea and sells it to such a point that they can get those voters and get that support? To me, if I'm a political party, that's the group that I need to target. Those are the policies I need to go after and say, we're going to work on changing those, because that's the future of political power in the United States. It's not us old folks that are going to go away either by COVID or old age or dementia or whatever that, my generation is gradually going to disappear over the next 15 or 20 years. These millennials are going to be around for the next 40. That's your power base. If I'm a political party, or I was thinking of starting a political party, those are the people you want to go after.
Listen to this. Populism. It's a political ideology, and it's referred to in the following way. Populism refers to a range of political stances that emphasize the idea of, quote, the people, and often juxtapose this group against, quote, the elite. Socialism is a political philosophy where social and economic philosophy encompassing a range of economic and social systems characterized by social ownership of the means of production and democratic control or workers' self-management of enterprises. It includes the political theories and movements associated with such systems. The simpler definition of that is policy or practice based on the political and economic theory of socialism. Are populism and socialism the same? No, they're not synonyms. But my point is they arise from many of the same concerns. They're different ways of addressing what the core problems are that we believe as a nation we're facing, right? Because Lance and I are not saying that these problems are fake. Why they're happening and why some claim they're happening, those reasons might not be true, right? But the reality is, as Lance shared, that statistic articulates part of what people are feeling. And we've also seen, and I thought this was very well illustrated, I am currently reading former President Obama's book, latest book, and I just read, just the other night, Lance, just before we recorded today's show, the part where he explained or he articulated what he believed to be the end of reasonable politics, which was right when he took office. You know, it was the beginning of the end. There were a few holdouts when he came into power, but the tide had shifted, and he traced it back to beginning with the signing of the Civil Rights Act. Because up until that point, there had sort of been a social agreement amongst the majority of Americans, right, that black people and women, quote, knew their place, right? And that was, just to be clear, that was not just the men and the white people, right? Society, in many ways, had agreed to this. Now, maybe they didn't like it. Not saying that they thought it was a good thing, okay? Not saying they didn't want it to change. But then as the change pushes forward, and again, this is not my argument. I'm just sharing with you what President Obama was explaining. As that pushes forward and subsequently breaks open the conversation about social issues, boom, the parties split and the divisions are sowed. Because now we're not talking about government policy, right? Which is a lot harder to make partisan. I mean, yeah, we can discuss economic theories and, you know, how we're going to manage the economy. But at the end of the day, when a lot of those things come up, there's a lot of room for some bipartisan work, because it's like, yeah, a lot of these are just, you know, it's just different ideas about what's best. It's not easy necessarily to tie it to a specific ideology. So there was a lot more room for working across the aisle, in part because the issues that were being taken on were not yes or no issues, right? They weren't, you're either for or against. It's, well, I'm for this and you're for this. So what's in between those things? And when you talk about something like abortion, as we've talked about before, that's one of those where it's a lot harder, right? And I've even heard current leaders of, social movements today, for example, say there is no middle ground on racism, right? There is no, well, I like to be a racist sometimes and other times I don't like to be, right? I mean, yes, there are people that are on the spectrum of realizing how much they are paying attention to race, but their point is, or at least what they're profusing, is that there is no middle ground, right? There isn't room for people in the conversation about abortion who are unsure or who are, quote, in the middle. They don't exist. They're not relevant, because that's not what makes these movements possible. And I guess, Lance, that's kind of the point that I thought Obama did a nice job of articulating. Again, regardless of what you think of him, it was a good point about why are we here? How did we get here? And now the question of, so where do we go? And that's exactly what we're going to talk about coming up. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Where do we go? Well, the question in some ways was easier for a lot of our history, right? Fight this war, defeat this enemy, tackle this specific challenge. Here's the pathway. Here's how we do it. Here's how we define victory. One of the challenges of becoming an advanced society, and not just America, but the world globally, is that we're tackling issues now that are a lot more nuanced. Climate change, for example, right? Yeah, how do we define when we've won? How do we battle it, right? Well, there's a lot of ways. There's a whole host of ways that we can fight climate change, and most of them are not super simple and cut and dry. How do we win World War II? And not to make it sound, because I'm not saying that it was easy by any means. I think it was probably one of the hardest things the nation's ever done. The point is, though, everybody understood this is the enemy, right? And to beat it, we're going to have to produce more than we've ever produced. We're going to have to fight harder than we've ever fought. And a lot of people are going to have to die. We're going to have excellent strategy, right? We could define clearly, here are things we must do, right? And they're not overly complicated things. The execution of them might be complicated, but the thing itself, we knew what we were fighting. And there was an enemy, right? A person that we could point to and say that's the enemy. So in the absence of that, with all of these modern issues we face, we now have to find people to place it on. So who do we place it on? The political opposition, regardless of whether or not it's their fault. And I think that's part of what brings us to where we are, Lance. And then that asks the question, well, how do we get out of here?
I think whoever goes after the group known as millennials or Gen Zers, that's where the future political power rests. So if you have somebody like, who's interested in a long-term power play, not a Donald Trump or a Mitch McConnell, who are both of, my generation, and they're older than me even, but they would be baby boomers. They're going to give way to somebody else, along with Nancy Pelosi and a Chuck Schumer. So it goes across party lines here. And I think the political strength of the next group will be who decides to promote and come up with answers to that question that we are going to make sure that you are at least as well off as your parents. And we're going to work really hard over the next 30 years, 40 years to make you more successful than your parents were. Like I said, if I was starting a political party, or if I were the Democrats or I were the Republicans, that's where I would be focusing my attention. Now, you know as well as I do, unfortunately, politics works more in the short term and not the long term. But I think so that's not going to happen. But that's what I think should happen. That's where I think whoever does that will be in control 20 years hence. They may not gain control in the 20s. And then you have the outlier of, okay, what world event is going to happen to affect the United States that we don't even know about yet? And I think that's a realism as well. But I think that's where the focus needs to be. If I'm in politics, is we need to start developing that plan to sell the reality that the American dream still lives to millennials. And I'm getting it right. The Gen Zers, right? That's the group behind this baby boomers getting it right. Okay. That's where I would focus. And even if I was in politics, even at my age, I would say, okay, I'm going to lay the groundwork for that. I'm going to pave the road for that way of thinking, because I think that's where the power lies. You can not agree with it. You can say, well, I don't think that's right. I
think
that's
the prediction is
go.
probably accurate. And as I'm listening and thinking about, what's next, you inevitably, and that's part of what we talked about, is where it came from. And you mentioned the American dream. And I think part of that is part of the frustration that you see amongst older and younger Americans for different reasons. It's kind of like that populism, socialism conversation, right? Because in some ways, we talk about Trump, right? That's what a lot of people keep referring to as Trump as a populist candidate, because he emphasizes, right, the will of the free people over, quote, the elite. Who else does that sound like, folks? And again, I'm not saying that Bernie's the same as Donald Trump, because I think anybody with half a brain knows that they're very different. But in that, they're very similar. And we don't talk about Bernie that way a lot, because everybody likes to focus on the socialism component, right? Because that's what we're focused on, socialism. But he's talking against the elite, right? Exactly. The people versus the elite. And my point there is what Trump was hinting at, a lot of his solutions dealt with what the older group was feeling, right? Which is thanks to the elite, for example, the tech elite, right? The changing in the economy elite. My coal job, my manufacturing job is gone, right? Thanks to them. And that's how I made my dream happen. On the other side, you have the people coming up and saying, what dream is there, right? My generation is going to be worse off to Lance's point, than any other generation. The difference is not in how they came to these things. It's the end answer and what they're turning to as a result, right? And to Bernie's credit, right, what he speaks about is not the coal jobs and the manufacturing jobs disappearing so much as he speaks about how expensive college is, how low the minimum wage is. And these are things, just for what it's worth, obviously, that don't affect most blue-collar manufacturing workers, because most of them make over minimum wage and most of them didn't go to college, right? So Trump is just taking a different approach, talking to a different group of people about the same problem. And that, to me, Lance, part of how you solve this, you want a better future, is we have to start recognizing that these are born out of the same concerns. And if at the end of the day, we're talking about the same problem, then we can have some coming together about how we fix it. Instead, we're letting leaders convince us, right, that it's the other side that's the problem, right? Trump is the problem, and Trumpism is the problem, and Bernie and socialism, those are the problems. And it's, nah. I mean, yes, those create issues, but those aren't the problem, right? They just have become a piece of the issue. And the issue, the greater issue, is we are facing a reckoning in this country, right? A change in how the economy is going to work for the future. The beginning of the end of a lot of physical-based labor. And that's only going to accelerate. The more automated vehicles become, the more automated our power grids, water systems, the more automated every facet of our life becomes, the less life is going to have room for those sorts of things. And that's where the problem lies. And to solve it, it's not just one side, right, Lance?
I mean, I'm just sitting here thinking, and as you're talking, I'm like, and you can kick and scream about it all you want, but it's going to happen. Just like 120 years ago, the farmers could kick and scream and say, we're losing our political power. It's going to the elites in the city. It's going to the manufacturing base. It's going to guys like Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller. It's going to them, and it's got to stop, and it's got to stop. Okay, guess what? You kicked and screamed about it, and it still happened. And the same thing's going to happen now. You may say, well, I want my coal job and I want my manufacturing job and you're uprooting my life, all of which are true. I'm not saying that's not occurring. You're right. All that's happening and all that's true, but you're not going to stop it. We're going to advance. Electric cars are coming. Power grids are going to change. We're going to use alternative fuels. Those things will happen. And you say, well, you're nuts. It's not going to, because I'm going to keep kicking and screaming until it doesn't. Well, it's going to, folks. You know, I mean, you have to resign, and I'm not saying you have to resign yourself to it, and you can make the way to that easier for everybody, but we can all complain about it. I can complain, you know, I mean, it's coming to fruition. I keep getting messages. My 3G phone is no good in 2022. You know, I can hang on to it and flip it open and do everything I want to do with it. But come 2022, if I want to talk to anybody on it, it's done. They're taking it away. So I can kick and scream and complain all I want. I'm going to have to get a new phone by the start of next year because the companies are all saying we're not going to service that phone anymore. So all my kicking and screaming and complaining ain't going to change it. That's my point, is all of these changes that you brought up are going to happen, whether we go along with them or not. So why not find a way to smooth the transition to that change? That's all I'm throwing out there.
And make the change work for us, because isn't, Lance, I mean, you're the historian. Isn't that what this country's really about, right? Make the change work for you. Not fight the change, not stop the change, right? Becoming the change, yes, and using the change to our advantage, because that's exactly it. You're not going to stop it. The most you might do is slow it down. But just like coal is gonna go away, whether it's in my lifetime, Gen Z's lifetime, it's gonna go away. It's gonna go bye-bye. That's just how it is, right? Because, hate to break it to you, but there's a finite supply of it. And once it's gone for a long, long, long time. longer than any person right now can live. And that's just one of many examples. It's like Lance's flip phone, right? Once it's gone, it's gone. They're not just going to bring back 3G someday just because they felt like it, right? I mean, it's gone. But why? Because something new, something better is available. And you can resist that all you want, but it will win, right? Just like time always wins, change always wins. It's just a question of whether we're going to use it to our advantage. But that's why we're having this conversation today, Lance, right? Because if you and I can take a little time to discuss some of the nuance that those big mainstream companies don't want to take time to discuss, then maybe a few people, those of you listening to this program, can help think that way too and help us come up with a better plan about how to make change work for us. And that's kind of what our mission's about, Lance, right?
It is. True Chat's mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we've done that today. And we've, maybe hopefully said some things that got you to thinking a little bit. You don't have to agree with us. Justin and I don't always agree, but we have the conversations because we need to talk about things so we can come to some kind of consensus to move our country and ourselves all forward. We don't want to be just stuck in the mud running, spinning our wheels. We want to be moving forward and making things better. So if you like the show, and please share it with your friends and family, and tell them that they can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere podcasts are found. And don't forget, we haven't done it much this show, but you can get a hold of us and, be like that listener that reached out to me with some information and might get used on the show. Contact us through email at podcast@thestateofus.org. So, Justin, we want to hear from folks, and we use it, we read it, and we're interested to hear what they have to say, because maybe they've got an idea we didn't talk about.
It just occurred to me, Lance, while you were speaking too. I think it's a neat thing. It's kind of coincidental, but for people that don't know, right, we're a syndicated radio show and a podcast. So we're not doing we're going to talk to just the old people that listen to the radio or the young people that listen to the podcasts. We're going to reach them in both places. And I think that speaks to part of what we're trying to do.
Was that your impersonation of me as an old person listening to the radio?
No, that was just the collectively, the collective old, the collective old. Yeah. No particular old person, in general, but it might be inspired, from those that I'm closest to that are old. So, but yes, we're a syndicated radio show and a podcast released by 4 a.m. Tuesdays and Thursdays. That's when you can get the podcast. Syndicated radio program is heard around the nation on the weekends, so be sure to check your local talk market. And if they don't carry us, call them up and tell them they should. That's part of how we continue this conversation, how we spread the word. For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our recording producer, Devin McCain, editing producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.